Okay, we're moving on to topic 5.6 as part of our Unit 5 revolutions. And so today we're talking about the government's role in industrialization. So we're still kind of on the Industrial Revolution, all the changes that happen with it. And so today we're going to talk about how governments will play a role in it. So the whole premise of today is going to be identifying and explaining the differences between the two big examples I'm going to cover in lecture today, and that is the Ottoman Empire and the Japan's era of the Meiji Restoration, which will become more clear as we get into the lecture itself. So I want you to talk about, explain the differences and those responses that you see within them, okay? So the first thing we're going to talk about is context, as we do always. And so European technology and industrialization begins to spread to other parts of the world. And we've talked about some of them already when they came to the United States, some of them to Russia, and Japan is some we also talked about. We're going to get a little more detail about the Meiji Restoration and Japanese industrialization this time period as well, because it really is about being kind of supported by the government and so forth. And that's why it's such a good example today. But governments around the world respond differently to it. And some, accept industrialization to try to find their own way to industrialize. Others reject industrialization in favor of more traditional ways. A good example of this would be China. China does not accept industrialization because the old traditional ways had worked out so well in China's history. I mean, they were the manufacturing centers of the world for such a very, very long time period. But as the world changed, they didn't adapt fast enough, and they end up becoming imperialized by much of the European countries, something we'll talk about in Unit 6. So, language of the curriculum. As influence on the Industrial Revolution grew, a small number of states and governments promoted their own state-sponsored visions of industrialization. So let's start with the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, as you guys will read in your book, it was become known as the sick man of Europe. And the reason why this is because in the later parts of the Ottoman Empire, especially in the late 1800s, they are going to go through a series of problems. Number one starts with a lot of government corruption. The government's bureaucrats were more focused on personal wealth and gain and prosperity rather than issues that are facing the country. And so because of that, in part, I should say, because of that, there is a lack of need to industrialize. I mean, Ottoman Empire was a pretty powerful, mighty empire for a very, very long time. But when they don't adapt quick enough and don't begin to industrialize the same pace as the Europeans have, they will be left looking, at the Europeans far ahead in military and economy and so forth. So because of the problems that are going on in Ottoman Empire, you have a lot of ethnic minorities that are breaking away. We talked about this in previous lectures with Balkan nationalism. You also have a lot of land that was lost to European countries, like Napoleon's wars that invade parts of the Ottoman Empire, particularly Egypt. And so over time, the role of the Sultan becomes less and less significant in different parts of the empire. And so one of those parts is one that will kind of break away from what the Ottoman Empire was doing and sponsor their own state version of industrialization. So that leads us to Muhammad Ali. Now, most of you, when you hear the name Muhammad Ali, you're thinking the boxer, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee kind of guy. But Muhammad Ali in world history, and he's not the only one in world history, as we'll find out in Unit 8, becomes known as the father of modern Egypt. And as the father of modern Egypt, it's really his vision that sets Egypt down the path of becoming one of the first industrialized countries in the Middle East. And so his idea, once the French leave Egypt, he kind of fills the power vacuum that was there. Now, even though it's technically still part of the Ottoman Empire, there is going to be a lack of ability to control those territories, and the Ottoman sultans really have no choice but to simply let the rule of Muhammad Ali occur and happen. And I'll link some videos that kind of talk more about this in details. But he develops a state strategy to try to build his country's economy and industrialize through the export of cotton textiles. Now, Egypt, along the Nile River, is a very fertile land, and cotton grows extremely well there. The quality of it is just more advanced than what is being produced by the French and the British. And so he invests into the cotton industry by, first of all, taking control of the farmlands from private owners, as well as the Church of Islam. I don't know if that's the right term, but they take the land from them, and it's put under state control, and then they have state-run cotton plantations and production going on. And then they take their cotton and then they also build factories that would spin them into textiles. And so cotton becomes something that was a very high quality cotton textile coming from Egypt. And the money they were able to gain from this then is turned into helping boost other sectors of their economy, creating more education opportunities for the public. And this is really what helps modernize Egypt. And they do so separate, even though they're technically still part of the Ottoman Empire, they're doing this separately from the Ottoman Empire. And it's one of those things that kind of leads to why Egypt becomes independent of the Ottoman Empire before its collapse. So we move over to East Asia with Japan. And Japan is going to be part, and this is some things I've talked about in previous lectures, so if you already kind of know this, you can just skip ahead if you need to. But the Meiji Restoration is going to follow a long period of Japanese isolation from 1600 to 1854. And if you recall the Shimabara Rebellion, where that pretty much caused the Tokugawa shogunate to kick out any foreigners, sans the Dutch, which they had small ports access to, in Japan. Other than that, they kicked them out because they were afraid of this foreign influence that would, take away their culture from them. And so that's what the Tokugawa shogunate does. But after several hundred years, there's a consequences to being isolated from the rest of the world. And it shows up in 1853 in the form of an American Commodore of Navy, Matthew C. Perry. Matthew C. Perry arrives in Japan with new modern battleships, steamships, really. And in 1853 shows up and he demands that the Japanese open up their trade or their border for trade with the West, and particularly America. And initially they refused in 1853, but in 1854 he comes back with more ships and he sails them right into Tokyo Bay. And this is a show of force by Matthew C. Perry, and the Japanese get the message that they no longer can really keep out the Europeans, and the best thing to do is to lean into it, right? And they realize that they had fallen so far behind the rest of the world that they have to catch up, and they must do so to protect their culture. So ironically, they must westernize in order to protect their their cultural identity of being Japanese. And so they sent out missions to go do fact-finding, and they are going to undertake a period known as the Meiji Restoration. So the shoguns are overthrown, they restore the power of the emperors, and they create a constitutional monarchy. They get rid of feudalism, so no more samurai, no more daimyo, and the constitutional monarchy itself, the emperor is the symbolic leader of the country, but his advisors and the people who are running the government are the true power, and they are going to help modernize the country. And so they make a lot of reforms. They model a lot of their military, their government after Europeans, like the Prussian constitutional monarchy became the model that the Japanese used to help create their own government. They create and establish equality under the law that ends cruel and unusual punishment, ideas they got from the United States. And other countries, but the United States is part of that. And they reorganized the military structure. The army looked like the Prussian army. The navy looked like the British navy. Those are two pretty good, ways to restructure your military. And they created new schooling systems that were very controversial because they used tax money. In fact, roughly 2,000 schools were burned down because people were mad about the taxes that were used to pay for those. But anyway, they built railroads, lots of railroads across the country, and Japan it's a fairly large island, and it's got some very difficult terrain that they must navigate through. And so that's something that the Japanese did, and they subsidized industries that they excelled in, like tea, silk, weaponry, shipbuilding, and sake, which is basically rice wine. And they allowed private investments within their country as well. This was so successful. The Japanese were the most successfully industrialized country in the world. The first ones in East Asia, number one. They did so merely in about 50 years, which was much faster than what you saw in the United States, as well as the in the United Kingdom and much of Europe. And so, yeah, the Japan had really taken this industrialization to heart, and it was all supported by the government who was pushing for this. They banned old style traditional forms of clothing and the way people wore their hair to reflect more, what do I call it? Westernized versions of it, as you kind of see here. This is more Western style clothing, not your traditional. Here's more of a traditional, is right here. But then you have the Western styles here. So it's kind of blending a little bit of the two, but a lot of it was outlawed. And it did have some pushback, but that's something they did. Now, I'm putting the link to this in the Canvas page, and so I do encourage you guys to watch this one. We did it so in class, but that was essentially what we covered in class, and how two different examples of states supporting how they went about with industrialization are right here. So with that being said, this is Mr. Henry signing off.